Hello everyone, I'm Hannah and I just want to start by saying thank you very much for having me here today to speak at this kind of celebration of rural women. It's been so great to listen to all the really interesting presentations throughout the morning, highlighting the really important research that's going on around the world concerning gender and the rural, especially as I'm from the Shetland Islands originally. A lot of the transport issues has been really interesting, and some of the concepts of the bus stops being miles away has been quite relatable in a lot of ways. So as Budge said, I am a PhD researcher at Newcastle University in the Centre of Rural Economy. I am supervised by Professor Sally Shorthall, who, yes, really encouraged me to take part today, which is excellent. My PhD is funded by the Economic Social Research Council and is going to examine women in agriculture in the industry in the Scottish Islands. So in January 2020, I won the Rural Policy Learning Commons research grant, which will allow me to travel to 2 Canadian islands, Prince Edward Island and Newfoundland, which then I will be able to compare the experiences and the barriers faced by women in the agriculture industry across these 2 Canadian islands and the Scottish Islands. So I've just entered my 2nd year of my PhD, which means I've just started my full research due to coronavirus. This has meant that there's been quite a lot of alterations to my original research schedule, which I'm sure many of you will be able to relate to. For example, I was actually supposed to be in Canada right now carrying out the research, which I do think about frequently. But this has now been changed to April to June 2021 in hope that possibly if travel restrictions will have eased by that point, but obviously that'll just have to be reviewed again closer to the time. So instead, I've moved forward my interviews for the Scottish Islands and had to change to a lot of online methods and telephone interview methods, which I'll kind of speak about the kind of pros and cons of this later on in my presentation. So during my master's, which I did prior to my PhD, I did work experience with Professor Sally Shorthall and the Women in Agricultural Task Force that was set up by the Scottish Government in response to research that was commissioned by the Scottish Government, which was entitled the Women in Agriculture Report in 2017. And this piece of research was done to highlight a number of barriers and the subsequent solutions for women in the agriculture industry in Scotland. It took a broad sample from the Scottish mainland, but it did not have a specific island component, which my PhD will hopefully seek to fill. I will firstly go on to talk about now, first broad overview of women in agriculture, and then go into both a UK and Canadian context, and then specifically about how I'm hoping to fill the gap in the research in the literature by looking at those specifically who are residing in the islands in the UK and Canada. So history would kind of present its agriculture as a traditionally male occupation, with it being associated with physically demanding labour. However, this is not the case, with women have always played an essential role in the farming industry. And although there has been an increased awareness of these key roles, which I'll speak more about later, about women who have played this, there remains a global differences between the gender in the agriculture industry in terms of ownership and management. For example, the extent of the gender and agriculture issue is highlighted by the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, which goes as far to state that if women were given the same level of resources and access to land, there would have been a reduction of hunger felt by 150 million people, and that was by the UN Women 2020. So this was due to the lack of resources and opportunities that are available for women, which prevents them from maximising their agriculture productivity in developing nations. So in the UK context, during the 1980s, UK academic research increasingly recognised the historic lack of recognition it gave to women, who have always been an inherent and necessary part of the family farm business. This was in part due to women being simply recorded as farmers' wives or spouses in statistics, which was an inaccurate reflection of their roles. It prevented their work of being always expected to help out during busy periods, such as lambing and calving, and also having to be expected to help with the admin and the accounts for the farm, which was really an especially necessary part in family farm businesses to their survival. So additionally, the off-farm work that women were expected to carry out in order to supplement the farm's income, in addition to their farming and domestic duties. In terms of rural women in Canada, the spark for change occurred in the 1970s by the case of Murdoch versus Murdoch, where a woman filed for separation from her husband and was not awarded any part of her ranch that her and her husband had built up throughout their 25 years of marriage. This was despite the fact that she contributed both financially and physical labour throughout the farm, and the farm business would not have been viable without her efforts. So Matcham in 2005 highlighted that the judge ruling that this was to be expected of any ranch wife. This was met with a really strong retaliation from the general public, who realised the reality of the fragile position of farm women across the country. Additionally, the expectations placed upon a ranch wife to work hard and contribute massively to the land holding, but not to be guaranteed any safety net if they separated from their partner. So this led to a big change in Canadian law, where both partners are now entitled to half of the family assets. So from that case, groups such as Concerned Farm Women and Women for the Survival of Agriculture were created, which aim to help rural women improve their lives and give them access to credit, training programs, childcare, health and safety programs, and new government tax regulations for greater equality on the Canadian farms. So a consideration which these bodies had to take was whether it would be best to create a separate group for women or to try to do this from within existing farming organisations. This is a debate which continues today, which some people have just spoken about as well, as whether women-only groups are the best way forward. Shorthall et al. In 2017 calls it a double-edged sword, as sometimes by creating a separate entity for women, it could further distance them from the mainstream organisations in the agriculture industry. And this could potentially further divide the genders in the farming industry, rather than close that gap between them, despite obviously the very best intentions being at the heart of the idea. So it's difficult to balance to create a separate safe space for women, but still ensuring that they have an effective voice in mainstream organisations, which wield much of the influence and power over the whole agriculture community itself. It also sheds light on some of the industry, that if this is still required, that men are still presumed to be the norm, demonstrated by the need to add women in front of the group, showing that the assumption really remains that being a male farmer is the norm, which could unconsciously reinforce pre-existing stereotypes. However, there's obviously been undoubtedly much progression in the agriculture industry, with a much higher proportion of women managing farms and crops in their own right in modern times. For example, the 2019 Scottish Agricultural Census showed even just a 4% increase of the proportion of women working on farms compared to 2018. However, even with this progression and with more women working on farms, recent research has highlighted that there are a number of barriers that still remain for women. And this is highlighted in the 2017 Women in Agriculture report, which I've spoken about previously, and the resultant task force that I mentioned. So the barriers identified from this report included traditional practice, such as the continued tendency for land to be passed to the eldest male in the family. Also, a lack of women in leadership positions within agricultural organisations. For example, the National Farmers Union elected their first female president in 2018, who has recently been re-elected. However, it should be noted that it took over 110 years of the history's organisation to have a female president. It is a similar position in Canada, with the Canadian Federation only electing their first female president after 84 years. Furthermore, the results from the 2017 Women in Agriculture report highlights one of the top reasons in the survey for the lack of progression is the lack of time that they had, as women are predominantly expected to juggle childcare and other commitments, as well as complete their expected farm duties. In terms of the prevention of women from joining more committees to increase the representation, from the Women Empowerment report, the survey highlighted that it was hostility and ridicule that they're met when they're trying to join some organisations. Obviously not every organisation. These problems highlighted in the report show that there are many barriers which are still needed to overcome, even in modern day agriculture. So the Women in Agriculture report, which I've spoken about, presented various solutions to these issues. For instance, women-only training groups. Hello, was I muted for a moment there? Oh, okay. Oh my goodness, okay, that's good. So the Women in Agriculture report presented various solutions to these issues. For instance, women-only training groups, mentor scheme, and much about raising the awareness of the issue itself, and effectively really holding the industry to account. Although much of it details makes prominent the issues of conscious and unconscious bias has for women in the sector, and that it will require more than a year-long task force to implement the changes that are required. Highlighting that it's a long-term solution and by no means a quick fix. The change in cultural norms that are required to be altered in order for a more equal agricultural society are far to go. As I mentioned, the report took a broad sample from the Scottish mainland and from some of the Scottish islands. However, it lacks a specific island component, which my thesis will seek to fill. With the Island Scotland Act 2018, which aims to give it increased powers to island communities, and the first published academic book specifically on gender studies and its relation to island communities, was entitled Gender in Island Communities, edited by Ghanaian Narson, was only published in March 2020. The purpose and need for that book was summarised by the editors as a research gap exists in terms of taking an explicitly feminist approach to studying gender and social inequalities in island settings. So these factors really highlight the timely nature of my research, and furthermore, from a Canadian perspective, the Prince Edward Islands Department of Agriculture and Fisheries in 2019 tried to find out the barriers for women in these respective industries by doing a survey. The published report highlighted that only a third of respondents believe that there are any existing barriers for women in the industry, with half of men believing that there are no barriers for them at all. So this really suggested a lack of public awareness surrounding these issues and really adds to the necessity of the research that I'm doing. So throughout the past year, I've been examining both the historic and the recent literature surrounding this topic. And from this, many things have become evident. Firstmost, from a historic perspective, it's become clear that women have in fact always played a key part of the crofting and farming landscape in the Scottish Islands, despite it being depicted as men's work. As though men were always seen at the forefront of the business, it was the women in the household who did a lot of the work. This was due to the fact that in previous centuries, a lot of the island men had to spend the summer months fishing in the North Sea and Atlantic Ocean in small boats. This was in order to sell the fish to make money and for food for the family over the winter months. This resulted in the women tending to the crops over the summer months and carrying out tasks such as the sowing of the crops, cutting and storing the winter supply of peats which they burnt in the fires from the hills, and starting the harvest. This highlights that women were always very capable of the tasks, and some may then argue that this created a much more equal island society, with everyone being expected to do physically demanding work despite of their gender. However, there was still a division of labour according to gender, and women were always seen more in the helper's role rather than the manager's one. This can be summarised by a quote by Abrams in 2005, that it is only in the absence of men that women could demonstrate their multiple skills, and Mackenzie in 2019, that despite men always being seen as the breadwinner, it was the women who were head of the hearth. demonstrating that women were always viewed as a substitute to men rather than the leader or main crofter. Therefore, a gender divide was always present on the islands, regardless of the fact that it was widely acknowledged that women were just as capable as men in many respects. So the founding fathers of sociology noted that comparative analysis is the bedrock of analysis identifying social patterns. The comparative approach in the study will be invaluable and allows for an exploration of parallels and differences in the current barriers faced by women in both the wider Scottish and Canadian context. In addition, my study will seek to address the gap in the literature, that is, the different barriers that women in agriculture face, both within and between the island communities. As the current research on gender in agriculture in Scotland and Canada does not have a specific island component. So my research will focus on factors such as the various land tenure systems on the islands and the religious differences, and if these impact on the agricultural communities. It will be determined whether or not these factors have a greater influence on gender equality on farms than the geographical location. So to do this, an island from each of the 5 Scottish Island Councils, Argyll and Bute, Island Star, Highland Council, Orkney Council and Shetland Council will be used in the sample, providing a representation of the various arpeggios. The Scottish Government is aware of the need for more research on this topic, demonstrated that this is a collaborative project with the Scottish Government. And for the Canadian element, the Prince Edward Island and Newfoundland will be examined, and this will allow for the comparison made between both the 2 Canadian islands and the selected Scottish islands. So I am currently conducting my research by doing interviews. I had originally planned to do this in person, however, due to coronavirus, this has meant I've had to change to an online method. This has presented its own challenges. At the start of lockdown, I moved back from Newcastle back to Shetland, the Shetland Islands. So I was with my family during this time, and also so that I could help out on my family farm that my sisters manage, so that I was home for lambing and calving time and to help out during this busy period. I feel this has been great in many ways, and I'm very lucky that I was able to do that. It has come with some downfalls, mainly in that my internet connection is not the best of times, especially when my other family members are also trying to use the internet to work from home. For example, today I'm very pleased that it stood up throughout the whole of this talk, and I also considered making a PowerPoint presentation. However, I was also concerned that my internet crashed halfway through, so played it safe and just chose to do the speech instead. For my research, this presents method issues for doing research about a rural area, whilst also being situated in a remote rural area myself. For instance, considerations of connectivity, which will impact on the ability of those participating in online interviews. So I've really had to think creatively about ways I can get around this issue. For example, by also offering to do telephone interviews. This may also be more inclusive, as some folk may not have access or may choose not to have access to internet. So I'm planning to do my interviews in the next few months. I've completed my pilot interviews, which have allowed me to reflect on my interview questions themselves, with some interesting themes already emerging. For example, there's a point raised about informal networks that were key for knowledge exchange and training opportunities, which some women might not have access to. So the next stage for me is to move on to the main cohort of interviews with people who work in the agriculture industry. So I'm really looking forward to getting into that and seeing what the data generates. So just to conclude, I would again like to say thank you very much for asking me to take part in such an important day. Again, I've really enjoyed hearing all about the different presentations and the ongoing research that's being done. And we'd like to wish everyone a happy Rural Women's Day. So I will now answer any questions that people may have about my talk.